Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Ukraine and the law of unintended consequences. The West's engineered regime change in Kiev has left Ukraine with a central government of dubious legitimacy, an economy in freefall, and fueled secessionist sentiments. Russia has made it clear it will protect ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. Washington warns Moscow of the cost of doing so. It would appear Putin has called Obama's bluff. To CrossTalk the crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Nebojsa Malic in Washington. He is the director of the Rice Institute for Serbian Studies. In London, we have Alexander Mercouris. He's a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. And in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sleboda. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Alexander, if you're watching another television station right now or reading a Western newspaper, you're reading that Russia is going to invade or already has invaded Ukraine. Deconstruct that for me.
Well, Russia has not invaded Ukraine. Russia has the parliament in Moscow, the upper house, passed a vote which said that Mr. Putin is authorized to send troops into the Ukraine to help stabilize the situation there if basically there is a threat to Russian citizens and Russian interests. Now, that is not an invasion. It is not an attack on the Ukraine's territorial integrity. In fact, may I say that what is holding the Ukraine together at the moment as a state, what is preserving, if you like, the fiction that there is a Ukrainian state, is that Russia continues to recognize it. If Russia stopped recognizing the Ukraine and its present borders, it would very rapidly fall apart.
Okay, and Nebojsa, how do you react to all of this? Because, I think it's the Guardian today is saying that Russia is acting like a 19th century power. But just to kind of echo what Alexander had to say right now, is that it's Russia itself that's keeping Ukraine together.
Well, this is your typical projection that I've seen. I'm having images in my head replayed back to like 1992 and 1999. I've seen all of this exactly, the exact phrases, the exact people saying them even in some cases. Already in the example of the former Yugoslavia, when the Federation was forbidden from defending itself, and then when the separatists took over, their territorial integrity became sacrosanct, except in cases where it wasn't, because the U.S. backed the separatists. In essence, no principle was in effect except whatever the government in Washington said it was at any given time, and it was just a complete disaster, and the region has never recovered from it. And I'm watching that happen in Ukraine, and I'm watching the breathtaking hypocrisy and duplicity of the Western media, who count on the fact that people don't have any sort of memory that reaches beyond yesterday.
Yeah, it's very interesting.
Because if they had any sort of memory...
Yes, Mark, if I go to, let's talk about facts here, okay? One of the things I find extraordinary looking at Western media is that there's not a specific mention that there are Russian troops already in the country, in Ukraine, under treaty agreement. And, and they're saying that, they're a threat to the sovereignty of Ukraine, which, in fact, the Ukrainian government, before the situation in Kiev, allowed the Russians to be there, and the Russians actually pay to be there.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say, for the benefit of our viewing audience, a full disclosure. I have family in the Ukraine. I have family in the Crimea, in Kiev, and elsewhere in the country. So for me, this is a personal issue. As to the presence of Russian troops normally in the Crimea, you are correct. There is normally stationed something 26,500 Russian troops by treaties signed between the legitimate government of the Ukraine and the Russian Federation. So these troops have only left their bases under terms of transit that are allowed per this treaty, according to permission from the cognizant authorities of the Ukraine. The cognizant authority of the Ukraine is the only legitimate authority in the Ukraine at present of this level, is the president of the Ukraine, who is Viktor Yanukovych. And he has requested, along with the prime minister of the Crimea, that Russian forces act within the borders of the Crimea to secure and stabilize the situation from attacks and raids by right-wing ultranationalists that have been directed from the putsch regime in Kiev.
Alexander, it's one of the interesting things is Western media doesn't like to use the term right to protect. And the West loves to use that, you know, to overthrow regimes here. But there are millions and millions of ethnic Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine. And Russia is invoking essentially the right to protect. But it's not recognized in the West. Why?
Well, Russia is not using actually R2P, but let's just concentrate on the right to protect. Right to protect is a doctrine that the Western states have invented for themselves and which they treat as possessing. And basically, they see themselves as the only people who have a legitimate right to use it. They own it, they use it, they overthrow governments when they want to. And they don't accept that anybody else ever has the right to use it. What Russia is doing is it's not actually using right to protect. It's using something rather more straightforward, which is it's protecting its national interests and its citizens who are in the Ukraine now. Russia has not moved troops into the Ukraine. It has said it will if those people there are threatened and attacked. And that is actually a pretty legitimate position. It's one that many states have adopted many times, and I think it is consistent with norms of behaviour that states use.
Okay, you know,
incidentally, can I just go back to one thing about 19th century policies? What is, of course, actually happening is that the country that's acting in a 19th century way, in the sense that it's trying to expand its influence, is the United States. It takes upon itself the right to expand into other places and overthrow governments there and disregard international law. What it doesn't like is when other countries resist it doing so, and for people to talk about 19th century behaviour in this situation, it is again to turn reality, it seems to me, entirely on its head.
Okay, Nebojsa, let me go. I was going to go in that direction anyway. President Obama has warned Russia there will be costs. That sounds like 19th century language to me. Go ahead. What does that mean to you? Nebojsa in Washington, go ahead.
It actually sounds to me like 5th century politics, but 5th century BC. Anybody who's read Thucydides knows that the Athenians came to the island of Melos and said, submit or die. And the Melians said, well, why do you do this? There are rules among men. You shouldn't oppress us just because you can. And the Athenians said, oh, yes, we can, and that's exactly why we're doing it. We're stronger, we'll take you out. And they did that. Of course, they lost that entire war, and that's a lesson that nobody seems to be learning from it. This is remarkably crass, that what I'm hearing, the whole notion of there will be cost of intervention. As I said the other day, Mr. Obama should be taking his own advice and talking to his own people at the State Department, which I don't think he's doing. I think there's a seriously rebel faction within the United States government running its own foreign policy and forcing the president to either accept it or admit that he's powerless.
Okay, Mark, one of the things I find very interesting, going back to Victoria Nuland's telephone conversation, it seems to me one of the primary interests that the United States has in Ukraine is it wants Crimea, but that seems like the only place it won't get, depending on how events unfold as we go forward here.
Well, I wouldn't say so much that the United States wants the Crimea, although it would certainly like to see the Russian naval base in Sevastopol removed. I don't think that the United States, in and of itself, has a whole lot of interests in the Ukraine. The interest of the United States in the Ukraine is to separate it from Russia, and this is operating under what is actually a 19th century ideology of what has been spoken of many times in the Western press, this idea that they see Russia with the Ukraine as an empire, but Russia without the Ukraine is only a country. And of course, this has actually never been about a Russian empire or Russian having the Ukraine, but it has been about fanning sectarian tensions in order to annex the Ukraine into the European Union and the greater transatlantic community. And what we've seen with this attempt, as was cynically displayed in the Nuland tapes, Victoria Nuland, who acting like a U.S. proconsul dictating who the next government of the Ukraine will be, this is clearly a case of one regime change attempt too many. Putin has drawn a red line and said that enough is enough.
Okay, Alexander, this is interesting, a red line. But I think this time Mr. Putin usually really answers to his own questions here. I mean, he says this is a red line. Do you think the Western powers are going to take it seriously, or are they going to miscalculate still again?
Well, I don't know that they have actually many options in this situation. A military challenge to what the Russians are doing is simply out of the question. There is no possibility, I think, of Western military intervention in the Ukraine. Mr. Obama talked about costs. The only cost he could come up with was basically ending Russia's membership of the G8. That is a Western directory of the world economy that has well past its sell-by date. I don't think anybody in Russia is very impressed by that. Mr. Putin actually didn't even go to the first G8 summit after he was re-elected president. So they can try a few financial sanctions, but ultimately they need to talk to the Russians. They can't avoid doing that, whatever they may say.
All right, gentlemen, I'm going to jump in
costs,
here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT.
I love it.
It was a terrible mistake, and we're working very hard to make up for it.
And once again, we put something on the air. It's a flat-out lie.
Have you ever had sex with Governor Rick Perry?
No, wait. Do not answer that. I want you to watch what we're about to do, because you've never seen anything like this on television.
Winter is when the Sahara comes to life. Oasis palm trees are being harvested. People are waiting for the biggest event of the year, the Desert Festival.
This festival is very hard race.
Leading camel racers have spent the last year preparing for the grueling marathon. The day before the race, there's a heavy sandstorm. Overcoming the power of nature is a never-ending challenge. Sahara, a desert winter, on RT.
The wheel caught on the roadside. The car skidded at breakneck speed and fell into a ditch, and I was thrown out of the car.
She was like a broken doll. There wasn't a single whole piece left.
I thought if I lived and had a chance to start my life from scratch, I would start making dolls to help children.
Right after he was born, the baby was all in casts. His legs are getting bigger, and the orthoses get too small, so we have to order new ones.
Svetlana has raised money for us.
She helps us to get leg braces.
5 years after my potentially fatal injuries in a car crash, I gave birth to my little Michelle. I think she's my reward for helping all those children. We're selling the dolls to buy life for the children.
I love you. And he's charged.
Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the recent events in Ukraine. Nebojsa, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. Mark started on in the first part of the program. What is Washington's interest in Ukraine? Because one of the interesting things that I find is there's this focus now on Crimea and the East, but there's not that much attention going on right now in Kiev. And this is a regime that is, an illegitimate regime that is supported by the West. And the IMF is going to be knocking on the door. I mean, even if they could come to a deal, who are they going to give the money to? To some thugs in Kiev? For half the country? For what purpose? I mean, they've lost the plot here. I don't know what Nuland was thinking when she started this here, because there's no the answers are very limited right now. The options are very limited, if zero. Go ahead.
Well, there is no plot that involves Ukraine per se. The one thing that I need to make crystal clear is that the political establishment in Washington doesn't care a single bit about the Ukrainian people at all. Just like they didn't care a single bit about the Albanians in Kosovo and Albania proper back in 1999. Strobe Talbot, the leading Western expert on Russia, actually wrote a foreword to a book back in 2002 that openly argued that the Kosovo War in 1999 wasn't about Serbia at all or the Albanians. It was about the U.S. sticking it to Russia. So Ukraine is just the second chapter in that story. There's a political establishment here that really badly wants to take out Russia because of this insane fantasy they've got that the Russians are a threat. I don't know whether that fantasy is motivated by some sort of ethnic or religious personal issues that some of the people in the establishment might have. I don't want to get into that right now. But there is definitely that fantasy, and it's definitely driving their actions. So what they really want, their ultimate prize, is Moscow. And we've seen this before, time and again, from other would-be conquerors in Europe. And honestly, if the U.S. government or its political establishment think that continuing to behave like this will have a happy ending, they clearly haven't been paying attention.
Agreed. Mark, if I can go to you here in Moscow. One regime change too far, okay? One forced regime change too far for the State Department and for Brussels. Because I don't see what are the options on the table, because Mr. Putin is not bluffing.
No, Mr. Putin is not bluffing. And what he has seen clearly in the events in Kiev, and this is a putsch. This was the United States backing a front of peaceful democratic protests whose core and vanguard was a group of extreme right-wing ultranationalists and openly neo-Nazi paramilitaries led by the Right Sector, Spilna Sprava, and other such affiliated groups. And both the nominal liberal opposition, which the mainstream media would have you believe are actually in control in Kiev, and the Western governments hoped to play a cynical game of riding the tiger of this ultranationalist violence into power and then shunting them off to a side. And we've seen similar failed evidence of this type of tactics in Libya and in Syria, where violent Islamic jihadists were used. And there was the hope that they would simply be able to be put away, and a Washington-supported neoliberal, liberal, technical government that would reorientate the countries towards a Western geopolitical order would be able to be put into power. It's failed in Libya, it's failed in Syria, and it will fail once again in the Ukraine.
Alexander, it's very interesting here. Over the last few hours and days, there have been many protests or rallies, I would say, in eastern and southern Ukraine, and they're carrying a Russian flag and they're carrying a placard saying, "I'm Russian." And it's very interesting to me because it looks like the European Union gets left with the ugly duckling in the West, because it's not much of an economy there. Again, a thuggish regime that is illegal. I mean, this is a very interesting a process that's being played out right now, because the more they keep pushing and supporting this regime in Kiev, the more Russians in the East will gravitate towards Russia.
Well, exactly, and it really begs the question of what they all thought they were doing at all, frankly. I mean, if we go back a few months when Mr. Yanukovych decided not to sign the association agreement, he suggested tripartite negotiations with the EU and the Russians. Had that happened, we would not be in the situation we are in now. If you play an all-or-nothing strategy, which is what the West has been doing, the EU has been doing in the Ukraine, the very serious risk you run is that you end up with nothing, or, in this case, quite possibly worse than nothing. In other words, a broken, economically bankrupt, rump Ukraine, in which there are some extremely dangerous and violent people on the loose, and who will be very, very, very angry if this thing doesn't work out for them. So quite what the EU thought it was doing in this situation, I really can't see. But as Mark will confirm, people in Washington and to some extent in the EU are actually obsessed with geopolitics. If you read articles in the American academic media, they're full of this sort of thing. And they're constantly trying to play these intricate chess games with countries, manipulating people, violent people, changing governments, doing all these sort of things. And it never seems to work. And they never seem to learn. They never step back and ask themselves, was this right or was this wrong? And, you know, just one very last point. You said that Mr. Putin isn't bluffing. One of the problems is that he's beginning to look increasingly in this situation as if the West was when it comes to Russia in the Ukraine. And now it's they who have their bluff called, and they're looking very foolish.
Nebojsa, in Washington, it is very interesting because, again, I think we're all in agreement here, Mr. Putin isn't bluffing. So what does the West do now? Does it keep pushing? Does it keep pushing for violence? Does it want a confrontation? Because from what I can see in the east and south of Ukraine, they're very prepared and they don't want this scourge coming to them from Kiev. But the European Union, the Americans, it seems to me they don't have a policy here right now, except for they're really angry that their original plan has failed.
That's pretty much it. I don't think the EU is driving much of a muchness here. They were behind that February 21st agreement that the extremists in Ukraine basically violated within hours. And I don't think that the European Union is really being asked for much. I think the American opinion of the EU was very concisely and precisely expressed in Newland's phone conversation. And I think that's the prevailing opinion in the Washington establishment. What Washington is doing, I don't know. I mean, there are things that are looking like what they're doing, and there are things, and those things are completely insane, and I really don't want them to do that because, again, completely insane. A colleague of mine in Serbia said the other day in an interview for another network that the Russians might be playing chess, but the Americans are playing the only games they know, which is poker and American football. So brute force and bluffing. But they're in this case, they're the scrawny nerd that can't run and can't pass and can't throw the ball, and they're holding a pair of sevens. So I'm honestly not sure who they think they're fooling. They're only fooling themselves. But sooner or later, they're going to have to hit the reality wall and realize that the world is not a toy, that they can't do this to other people, that they can't do this to themselves. And I just hope it's a soft landing, because we are talking about people who are armed with nuclear missiles.
Mark, you know eastern Ukraine very well. You told us that you have family there. Describe what kind of people they are and what is their attitude towards Russia.
Okay, well, the people of the eastern Ukraine, since the events of 1992, have become rather cynical of politics. They were known particularly for their apathy towards the political spectrum. They are hardworking, pragmatic, and yes, often cynical people. But what we have seen across the east and south of the Ukraine in the last few weeks is a quite unique phenomenon in the politics of the Ukraine and in the former Soviet Union, where you see hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets and flying Russian flags, not only as a sign of thankfulness for the support of the Russian Federation, but also as an expression of their own cultural, linguistic, and historical identity. And they have very good reason to believe that that identity is under threat from extremists that have been put into high positions within this putsch regime, this Western-backed putsch regime that has seized power in Kiev. And when you have this regime, in a situation where the economy of the country is falling apart and the country is politically and ethnically divided, this regime's legislative priorities, which has railed through a Rada that has been assembled out of blackmail, physical threats, and literal beatings of parliamentarians. Their legislative priorities were revoking the rights of Russian speakers, and the majority of daily communication in the Ukraine across the country, whether in the internet, whether in literature read, on TV, spoken to each other, is still Russian. So they removed this right. And one of the other first pieces of legislation they passed was a removal on the ban of Nazi symbology and propaganda, which I don't see how anyone could conceivably argue, as many in the Western press have tried to do, that these right-wing factions, these extreme ultranationalists and neo-Nazis that are right now sitting in positions of power in
Mark,
Kiev.
let me jump in here. Let me give Alexander the last word because we only have like 30 seconds of Alexander. It seems like these radicals in Kiev are actually strengthening the national identity, ethnic identity of the folks in eastern and in southern Ukraine.
Absolutely, because what they are wanting to do is to completely change to the Ukraine in order to basically subordinate these people to their own very nationalistic and fascistic ideas. And the people in eastern Ukraine won't accept that. And what they're actually doing is that the people in the eastern Ukraine are Russian-speaking Orthodox Eastern Slavs. They've called themselves Ukrainians because that is the nation, the country in which they live. If that country has no
On that
place
point,
for
I'm
them,
really, gentlemen, I wish we had
as
so much
Russians.
more time, but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests today in Washington, London, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I'm see.
I love it.